It was a sunny afternoon when the phone call came, a shrill interruption in the quiet rhythm of our day. I answered, expecting the usual, a telemarketer or a chatty friend, but what I heard instead turned my world upside down. The officer on the other end spoke softly, but his words hit like a thunderclap. My husband Michael was gone. A car accident, sudden and unforgiving. I sank into the couch, the weight of grief pinning me down as the room spun around me. How could this happen? One moment he was here, filling our lives with his steady presence, and the next he was just gone. Days blurred into weeks. People came and went, their condolences kind but hollow. Each "I'm sorry for your loss" felt like a reminder of the void that now loomed in every corner of my life. But the hardest part wasn't the loneliness. It was trying to be strong for Ethan, our son. Ethan was just 17, on the cusp of adulthood but still so young. Michael had been his hero, his coach at soccer practice, his partner in weekend DIY projects. Now, all those moments were memories, echoes of a life we'd never get back. In the months that followed, Ethan and I fell into a strange rhythm. I returned to work part-time, and he threw himself into school and sports. We were like two planets orbiting the same sun but never quite colliding. I wanted to reach out to bridge the gap, but I didn't know how. Then one evening, as I was sorting through old photos, Ethan came into the room. He sat down next to me, his silence heavy. I passed him a picture. Michael and Ethan at the beach, their faces lit with identical grins. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "I miss him," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I do too," I whispered, my throat tight. It was the first time we'd talked about Michael since the funeral. Something shifted between us that night, an unspoken understanding that we were in this together. Slowly, we began to navigate our grief, not as two individuals but as a family. We spent more evenings like that, sharing memories and letting the tears fall freely. In those moments, I saw a side of Ethan I hadn't fully understood before, a depth of emotion and resilience that reminded me so much of his father. But as the months turned into a year, I noticed something else, something I couldn't quite name. Ethan's gaze lingered a little longer when we talked. His touch, a reassuring hand on my shoulder or a brush of fingers as he passed me a dish, felt different, softer, more intentional. First I dismissed it. We were grieving, vulnerable, leaning on each other in ways we hadn't before. But as time went on, I couldn't ignore the shift. Scared me not because of him but because of me. My feelings, the ones I couldn't name or explain, felt like a betrayal of everything Michael and I had built. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Ethan stopped me. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" I nodded, my heart pounding. He led me to the couch, the same one where I'd collapsed the day Michael died. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the unspoken filling the space between us. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "About us, about how things have changed." Froze. The words I'd been dreading and anticipating hung in the air. "Ethan," I started, but he cut me off. "I know it's wrong," he said quickly. "I know we're supposed to just be mother and son, but I can't help how I feel. And I think you feel it too." Tears welled up in my eyes as I searched for the right words. "Ethan, we've been through so much. Losing your dad, it's made everything harder, more complicated. But what you're feeling, it's grief. It's confusion. It's not." He reached out, his hand covering mine. "Mom, please don't dismiss this. I've tried to push it away, to ignore it, but I can't. You're the only one who understands me, who's been there for me. I don't know how to explain it, but No," I said firmly, pulling my hand away. "Ethan, I love you. But this isn't love, it's loneliness. It's the hole your dad left behind, and we can't fill it by crossing boundaries that aren't meant to be crossed." He nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I don't know what to do with these feelings." I reached for him then, pulling him into a hug. "We'll figure it out together," I said, my voice trembling. "But we have to do it the right way. For your dad. For us." That night, I lay awake for hours, my mind a storm of emotions. I knew we had a long road ahead, a path filled with healing and understanding. But for the first time since Michael's death, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were broken, yes, but we were still a family. And somehow we'd find our way back to the light. The days that followed were marked by a cautious silence between us. Ethan and I moved around the house as if we were avoiding stepping on fragile glass. I knew he needed space, and truthfully, so did I. What had happened on the couch lingered in my mind like a stubborn shadow. I replayed his words, the raw vulnerability in his voice, and the way his tears had fallen so freely. It broke my heart to see him struggling, yet I also knew I had to set firm boundaries, for his sake and mine. One evening, as the autumn air grew crisp and leaves swirled outside, I decided to address the tension head-on. I found Ethan in the backyard, sitting on the old swing that Michael had built when he was a boy. He looked lost in thought, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. Wrapping myself in a sweater, I stepped outside, the crunch of leaves underfoot announcing my arrival. He glanced up at me, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied, taking the swing next to him. For a while we sat in silence, the creak of the swing chains the only sound between us. Finally I spoke. "I think we need to talk." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "About what?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. "About us. About what you said the other night." I kept my voice gentle, steady, though my heart pounded. "Ethan, I know you're hurting. I'm too. But we can't let our grief twist into something it shouldn't be. I love you with all my heart, but it's my job to protect you, even from this." He let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the swing chains. "I know, Mom. I know it's wrong, but it's like I can't control it. And the more I try, the worse it gets." I reached over, placing my hand over his. "You're not alone in this. Grief has a way of making us feel things that don't make sense. Confuses us, especially when we're vulnerable. But these feelings, Ethan, they're not permanent. They're just a part of the process." He nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. "You're all I have left. And you won't lose me," I promised, my voice firm. "But we have to focus on healing, not on trying to replace what we've lost. Your dad wouldn't want us to drown in this pain. He'd want us to find a way forward." Ethan finally looked at me, his gaze searching mine for reassurance. "How?" he asked, his voice small. "How do we move forward?" It was a question I didn't entirely know how to answer, but I knew we had to try. "We start by being honest with ourselves and with each other. And we take it one day at a time." That night I started looking into grief counseling. I had resisted the idea before, convinced that I could handle the weight of loss on my own. But it was clear now that both Ethan and I needed help navigating the complicated emotions swirling between us. I found a local support group that met weekly, and after a little coaxing, Ethan agreed to attend with me. The first meeting was awkward. We sat in a circle of strangers, each of us clutching a piece of our shattered lives. An older man shared the story of losing his wife to cancer, his voice trembling with sorrow. A young woman spoke about the car accident that had taken her fiancé. As I listened, I realized how universal grief was, how it connected us all, even in its isolation. When it was my turn to speak, my throat felt tight. I glanced at Ethan, who gave me a small nod of encouragement. "I lost my husband," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "And it's been hard. Harder than I ever imagined. But what's been even harder is watching my son go through it too. I feel like I'm failing him, like I don't know how to help him the way he needs." As the words spilled out, I felt a weight lift from my chest. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the burden alone. The group's quiet nods and empathetic gazes were a balm to my fractured heart. Ethan didn't speak that night, but as we walked back to the car, he said, "That wasn't so bad. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless." In the weeks that followed, we made a point of going to the meetings together. Slowly, the walls between us began to crumble. Ethan found his voice, sharing memories of his dad and even some of the guilt he carried. Guilt for feeling relieved that he wasn't alone in his grief. Guilt for wanting to lean on me in ways that felt wrong. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything felt unbearable, when I wanted to retreat into myself and shut the world out. But each time I looked at Ethan, I reminded myself that I couldn't give up. He needed me and I needed him too. Our home, once a place filled with Michael's presence, began to take on a new life. We started new traditions. Game nights, movie marathons, even cooking meals together. It wasn't the same and it never would be, but it was ours. And in those moments, I saw glimpses of the young man Ethan was becoming. A man his father would have been proud of. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Ethan paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Mom," he said. "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For not giving up on me." I pulled him into a hug, my heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. "We're going to be okay," I said. And for the first time since Michael's death, I truly believed it. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but together, Ethan and I were finding our way. Step by step, moment by moment, we were learning to live again, not in the shadow of our loss, but in the light of the love that remained. The boundaries between us had seemed clearer after those early days of grief counseling. For a time, it felt like we were walking on stable ground again. Ethan began focusing more on his studies and soccer, and I threw myself into work and small home projects, determined to keep my mind occupied. But even as we healed, a part of our relationship remained tangled in an unspoken complexity. It was in the quiet moments that it became evident, when we were laughing over a card game at the kitchen table, or sitting shoulder to shoulder on the couch, the air between us heavier than it should have been. I felt it when he lingered a little too long in the doorway of my room to say goodnight, or when his eyes would meet mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken despite myself. One rainy Sunday evening, Ethan and I decided to bake cookies, a simple, light-hearted way to pass the time. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of butter and sugar as we worked side by side. We laughed as he smeared a streak of flour across my cheek, and I retaliated by tossing a handful at him. For a moment, it was easy to pretend everything was normal, that we were just a mother and son sharing a moment of joy. But then he reached out to brush the flour from my face, his hand lingering against my cheek. I froze, the playful atmosphere dissolving as his touch sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I pulled back quickly, turning away under the guise of checking the oven timer. "Ethan," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should." "I know," he interrupted, his voice thick with something I couldn't name. "I know, Mom. Sometimes it's hard." I didn't respond, afraid of what I might say if I opened my mouth. The cookies were forgotten as I busied myself cleaning up, my back turned to him. I heard him sigh and leave the kitchen, and the silence that followed was deafening. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that Ethan was pulling away again, not in the way he had after Michael's death, but in a way that felt more deliberate. He was quieter at dinner, spending more time in his room or at practice. I told myself it was for the best, that he needed space to sort through his feelings and that I needed the same. But late one night, I found myself knocking on his door. When he opened it, he looked surprised to see me. "Mom, everything okay?" "I just wanted to check on you," I said, fidgeting with the hem of my sweater. "You've been so quiet lately." He hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. His room was a mix of chaos and order. Soccer cleats tucked neatly under his bed, but books and clothes scattered across the desk and floor. I sat on the edge of his bed, unsure of how to start the conversation. "Ethan," I began, looking down at my hands. "I know things have been complicated between us, but I don't want you to feel like you can't talk to me about anything." He sat down next to me, the mattress dipping under his weight. "It's not that I don't want to talk to you," he said after a moment. "It's just, I don't know how to say what I'm feeling without making it worse." His honesty was both a relief and a weight. "You can tell me," I said softly. "I'd rather know what's on your mind than be left guessing." He nodded, his jaw tightening as if he were steeling himself. "It's just, sometimes I feel like you're the only person in the world who really gets me. And I know that's not fair to you. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. And I don't know how to make it stop." Tears pricked at my eyes as I reached out to take his hand. "Ethan, you've been through so much. We both have. And it's okay to feel confused. But what you're feeling, it's not wrong, it's just misplaced. It's the grief talking, not your heart." He shook his head, his grip on my hand tightening. "What if it's both? What if it's not just grief? What if I really—" I pulled him into a hug before he could finish the thought, holding him tightly as if I could squeeze the confusion out of both of us. "Ethan, we're going to figure this out," I whispered. "We'll get through it. Together." He nodded against my shoulder, and for a long moment we stayed like that, clinging to each other in the dim light of his room. As winter approached, the closeness between us deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the emotional bond. We were spending more time together, seeking each other out for comfort and connection. Movie nights became a near-daily ritual, and our conversations grew longer and more intimate. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a light-hearted comedy, Ethan rested his head on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it made my heart race. I told myself it was just a son seeking solace in his mother, but deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself leaning on him as much as he leaned on me. He was my anchor in the storm of grief, and I was his. But the lines between us continued to blur, and I began to question whether we were finding solace or falling into something neither of us could control. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the ground, Ethan came into the living room where I was curled up with a book. He sat down next to me, closer than usual, and took the book from my hands, setting it aside. "Mom," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need to tell you something." I looked at him, my pulse quickening. "What is it?" He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You're not just my mom. You're everything to me." The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket, warm and suffocating all at once. I reached for his hand, my own trembling. "Ethan," I said softly, "you mean the world to me too. But we have to be careful. We have to remember who we are to each other." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me that the path ahead would be anything but simple. As the snow fell outside, I realized we were standing on the edge of something neither of us knew how to navigate. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence and stillness. Inside, the air between Ethan and me felt anything but calm. His hand remained in mine, and I could feel his pulse racing just as fast as my own. My mind screamed for distance, for clarity, but my heart held me firmly in place. "Ethan," I began softly, my voice trembling. "You mean everything to me too, but this... We have to be careful. We can't let our grief turn into something it's not supposed to be." "I know," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I don't think this is just grief. I've tried to tell myself it is, but the truth is, you're the one person who understands me, who makes me feel like I'm not alone. And I care about you, Mom. More than I should." His words, though tender, were laden with a weight I wasn't ready to carry. I pulled my hand away gently, creating a small barrier between us. "Ethan, we've been through so much together, and I understand how close we've become. But we need to remember who we are to each other." He nodded slowly, his eyes cast down. "I know," he repeated. I wish things didn't feel so confusing." His vulnerability tugged at my heart, and against my better judgment, I reached out to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "You've grown into an incredible man, Ethan," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Your father would be so proud of you." His gaze lifted, meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You always say that, but I wonder, are you proud of me?" His question struck me, and I felt a wave of emotion rise in my chest. "Of course I'm proud of you," I said earnestly. "You've faced so much, and you've handled it with strength and grace. I'm proud of the man you're becoming. A faint smile touched his lips, and for a moment the tension seemed to ease. Thanks, Mom, he said, his voice almost a whisper. That means more than you know. We sat in silence for a while, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. I thought the moment had passed, that we had steered ourselves back into safer waters. But then he turned to me again, his expression unreadable. You're beautiful, you know, he said quietly. The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Ethan, I said, my voice a mix of warning and disbelief. I mean it, he insisted, his gaze unwavering. I don't think I've ever told you that, but it's true. You're beautiful inside and out. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The sincerity in his voice left me momentarily speechless. I wasn't used to hearing such things. Not from him. Not from anyone since Michael had been alive. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to a misplaced emotion, a part of me felt deeply touched. Thank you, I said at last, my voice barely audible. He leaned in slightly, his movements slow and deliberate. I mean it, Mom, he said again, his eyes searching mine. You're incredible, and I don't know what I'd do without you. I could feel the warmth of his breath, the closeness of him sending my heart into overdrive. My rational mind screamed for distance, but before I could act, he leaned in and pressed a light kiss to my cheek. It was brief, tender, and yet it lingered in the space between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. My breath hitched as he pulled back, his expression a mix of longing and uncertainty. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I shouldn't have done that. Ethan, I began, my voice shaking. This can't happen. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. And I think you feel it too, even if you don't want to admit it. His words struck a nerve, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. You're my son, I said, my voice firm despite the quiver in it. And I love you more than anything. But we can't let this confusion take over. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to the memory of your father. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'm sorry, he whispered. I don't want to lose you. You won't lose me, I said, my voice softening as I reached out to touch his hand. But we have to find a way to move forward. Together, but in the right way. We sat there for a long time, the snow continuing to fall outside, a silent witness to the complicated tangle of emotions between us. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of confusion and pain. But as I held his hand, I resolved to guide us both through it, one step at a time, one day at a time. For his sake, for mine, for the love we shared, no matter how complicated it had become.